Hello and welcome. I am the Restless Kaiser.
I'm Johnny B with a cup of tea.
James Workshop with a glass of water.
I'm Andy from Friends of General Haig with a glass of wine. Cheers.
Hey!
But together we are murdering for
advantage.
Hello there, guys. Gonna have a quick look at the comments, see who we've got here, and then we will get into the meat of the thing. Miller's Miniatures. He's looking forward to this, and he likes a bit of pike and shot. Alid, you normally go for modern stuff, Alid. Are you up for this? Nick from Team Clueless Games. The head rat is here. Hello. Rosie Raccoon in there, fluffing the boys, of course. Axe and Axe gonna catch us in the rerun. Saffron 69 Gary. Hi there, mates. That's Rosie. What is the crack indeed? Plastic Crack Gaming, not to be confused with the Plastic Crack Podcast. And fantastic thanks to Rosie. Oh no, thanks Rosie. I was wondering what you've been doing for her. Ian Harrison from Melbourne. Hello there, buddy. Solvent Abuse UK. Nice to see you again. Nick Games is here. Eric M is here. Thomas Chase is here. And Mythos from Frost and Fist. Hello there, beautiful people. Well, that's the comments. Last couple of times we've done one of these historical battle things, I've got zero hobby done, so I'm not even trying tonight. I'm not even gonna try. John, what are you up to?
Finishing off some Romans again. Still,
Romans.
Yeah, nearly done. Hello, Bill. Would you like to get out of the way, please? What are you up to, Mr. Workshop?
The continuing adventures of me not really painting Soviets. What are you up to, Andy?
Is that the Zis3?
I'm not even going to try, and I'm just too excited by being here with you guys. Just the idea of painting it, I couldn't do it.
Oh.
We can do one.
Just do one. All right.
Well, that's good. I was just going to say, before you say words and all that stuff, Mr. Andy, could you tell our wonderful viewers kind of who you are and what you do, sir?
So my name's Andy. I'm from the Friends of General Haig Wargaming group, and I wrangle toy soldiers as much as I can. And I have got a particular interest in the English Civil War and the 30 Years' War. So I like to game that in 28mm whenever I can. And that's it.
You like it when it comes to push of pikes, sir?
Oh, I do. I do like to push some pikes.
To block.
So we're gonna get into the part in a minute, but just a little bit about the background, because you're interested in this. You don't just push toy soldiers around, do you? You, like our young friend James here, have been involved with the sealed nutters in your misguided past. Is that right?
Yeah. I did that for quite a few years. I was in the sealed knot and trailed a pike and sometimes fired a musket when they decided that it was.
But you never got yourself a hoss, sir.
No, that was sort of serious, and if you fall off, it really hurts. So,
yes, I believe people have died doing that.
They're very high up. They're very high up when you sit on one. So I never went on a horse. That looked dangerous. But it was good. I did that for years and years, and met lots of friends that I still know and see regularly, and I met my wife in the sealed knot as well. So,
she was a
camp follower. Yeah.
Very nice. And James, you dabbled a little bit with this reenactment. Is that right? Followers. James, did you do?
Is that me? Sorry. Yeah. Hi. Yeah. I was. What regiment were you, Andy?
Sir Gilbert Horton's Regiment of Foot. So we're part of the Northern Army, the Royalist Regiment from Lancashire, obviously. Which is mainly because
I was a parliamentarian. I was a Bloomie
in Preston, and so he got caught up with the Lancashire lot, and then he recruited lots of people he knew back in the Midlands.
Nice. So you were a parliamentarian, were you, James?
All right, fair enough. I think that's the traditional way to get into it. Yeah, people drag you in, start drinking, Then
Yes.
before you know it, you're in a pike block firing a musket. It's just a massive piss up with gunpowder and big sticks, which I think is pretty much exactly the recruitment method from back then. So it works now.
Beer. There was definitely beer involved a lot of the time.
And injuries.
A lot.
And injuries, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
less injuries, or you just didn't notice because of all the beer.
So what was the most grievous injury you ever saw in your reenactment time, Andy?
Lots of people being stretchered off in sort of neck braces and things. That was quite an after yeah. Cuts and things. A friend of mine got a really nasty cut here. He's still got a nice dueling scar here where somebody's helmet caught him across, and he needed 4 or 5. I'd lost most of my front teeth, so.
You lost front teeth doing this?
Yeah. So a lot of those.
Hardcore.
That's hardcore. Wow. Yeah.
Sorry, a lot.
But yeah.
And as an aging gentleman myself, can I ask you, can you still squeeze into the outfit, sir?
I think the breeches may need to be let out a little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah. But it's a style of costume that quite suits the fuller gentleman.
Oh, really?
Actually, yeah.
I need to do this stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah, you can.
The fuller gentleman.
So big coats, and a buff coat and a sash, and something in a big hat
to hold it all together.
Yeah.
The older and less fit you are, the higher your rank was a general rule.
Sign me up.
Yeah.
It sounds interesting. So I'm building WWS World War Cynics, Hedgerows. Which regiments were you in, Andy? You did say, but I don't know whether we catched it.
That's the Guildford Horse Regiment of Foot, which I'm afraid we're royalists. Yeah. From Lancashire.
For the king, sir. For the king.
Yeah.
With all the pikes and swords, anyone got pike poked in the eye? That's what I was thinking. It's like, it was my mate Steve who got speared.
Yeah. There was a time when some people had plastic tips on the end of their pikes because it would look really realistic.
Right.
And somebody, there was an alleged story that somebody had a plastic pike sort of go behind their eyeball, sort of.
Oh, popped it out.
Yeah, but they were okay.
Get it in?
Yeah. Keep your head, a nice big broad brim on your helmet, and keep your head down. That was
yes.
That was the idea.
I sat down with a rum to watch this and let out my breeches. Yeah, that is tonight. So Uncle Andy is going to tell us a story tonight. So he's got some slides. He sent me some exhaustive notes. So we're going to talk about the Battle of Edge Hill in particular, but a little bit about the situation leading up, give the campaign some context. So if I bring up the slides in a way that we can still be seen, did that work? Boom!
Ooh.
There we go. Look at that. So over to you, Andy.
Right. So this is 1642. So the king and the parliament have been falling out for a number of years. And this has sort of been brewing and brewing. So that the reasons behind the war are long and complicated and still make historians money in writing books about it. So as wargamers, the exact causes for the war are probably less interesting than the battles themselves. But that in effect, things have fallen down to the point where the king's had to leave London, and the king and the parliament are starting to raise armies because this is going to come to a fight, in effect. So the king officially starts his war up in Nottingham. So he raises his royal standard and basically gives a big speech and declares that the parliament are basically a bunch of rogues, and he's raising an army to go and clear them out and set England to right again. So meanwhile, in London, the parliament, bankrolled by the merchants in London, who are, much as today, all the money is in London, are basically feel that they have to finally sort Charles out once and for all, and so they're raising a much more effective and better equipped army in London. So this is sort of in August, towards the end of August, and a lot of the royalist advisors with Charles are starting to become a bit worried, because actually they haven't got an army. You know, they've got a few hundreds of men. The king has tried to call out the local militias by basically saying, well, I'm the king, so I'm calling out the local militia. But they might be happy to defend their own homes, but they're not really happy about marching off to who knows where with the king. So he's struggling to put a force together. Meanwhile, with all the money in London, Parliament has appointed Robert Devereux as who's the Earl of Essex to lead their army. So he's quite an experienced commander. He spent a lot of time on the continent fighting. He's quite a cautious commander, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It makes him very popular with his troops, because troops like somebody who's going to be careful with them, careful with their lives. So he's very popular with his troops, but he's not I'm going to take risks to win this quickly. He's going to be methodical about things. So he leaves London eventually, marches north to Northampton.
Andy, on this one, I think one of the things about Essex, and it's common to a lot of not just officers in this period, but kind of throughout British history, we have this problem again and again, that we seem to breed an officer class which makes a good regimental captain, that makes a good the regimental officers. They're very good on the small scale, on the tactical, but we're not deployed big continental armies often. So I don't think the Earl of Essex had ever had a field command of his own, but he had been alongside. He had a lot of experience of warfare, battle, the soldier's life, but had never moved tens of thousands of men and dealt with all of that. And it's a very different job. I'm not sure. I think probably Prince Rupert is just about the only person in England who's done that.
Well, I mean, even at this period, Rupert hasn't, despite all his youthful enthusiasm, even Rupert hasn't actually fought and led a big command in a big battle.
Right.
He's seen a couple of big battles, but when we get to Edgehill, that's his first big command, and perhaps one of the reasons he acts like he does at the battle, because he's got a lot to prove. You know, he's built this reputation, and he's got a really important part in the Royalist Army. So he's got a lot to prove. He's 22 at this point, so he's really young.
I thought he was old, because he'd been in various battles on the continent. I assume he was a bit old. I knew he was young, but in this, when you're in the history book about someone being young, you think that could be 35, right?
Yeah. No, he was
general.
He was 22, so you can just imagine why the sort of senior Royalist commanders were all fed up with this bloke who for a start, he's not even English.
No.
And that was a big thing in this period. Foreigners, and so he's a foreign prince. He's 22. He knows nothing, sort of thing. So and the king basically trusts every word he says. So it's so it's a big thing. Yeah, but
so the king is actually the man who's taken the first action to bring us to conflict. He's raised his standard, which if you don't know, that's like we're going to war from medieval times. And the call goes out, the king's writ runs up and down the country and says, the king is raising an army, come here and fight, you owe me service. That's a time-honored thing that they do. Medieval kings that don't do that all the time. And that signals the kind of beginning of armed conflict. But really, until this point, there's not necessarily a war gonna happen. It's not like people decided to go to war and then raised armies. A lot of time has passed. The king left London months and months ago. Yeah. And he's just decided in late summer, right, we're going to do this. I'm going to put down these rebels.
That's right. And I think everyone's still sort of hoping it won't come to a fight. There'll be a lot of posturing, and then they'll sort it out. And especially before the king has got a sizable force, it's like, well, he hasn't got the men. It'll peter out, and he'll come to terms, and there'll be an agreement made, and it'll all be over by Christmas.
Yeah. Yeah, a common story. All right.
Yeah,
So I've been to so the King's Race is standard at Northampton.
Yeah.
He puts this massive 2-meter square flag on a big
Yeah.
pole, and then what happens?
Well, I mean, I guess one thing to note is that it's put up next to Nottingham Castle, and overnight it blows down. So they get up in the morning, and the standard has blown down. So was that an ominous sort of foretelling of what's going to happen? But the king marches off west towards Shrewsbury. So there's a lot of support for the king, or more support for the king in Wales and in the northwest. And he does start to actually gather more and more men. So Essex spends a lot of time in Northampton training his army, because although both sides have got lots of experienced officers who fought on the continent, the majority of the people in the armies have never seen a battle, never fought before. So
soldiers are in their 20s, but officers are in their up to 60, 70.
Yeah. So there's a lot of keen people, there's a lot of enthusiasm, whipped up by lots of the pamphlets were the big thing, and so they're all going to sort the king out and sort these cavaliers out, and they're going to sort the roundheads out, the insult for the Puritan haircuts. But to everyone's surprise, Charles actually does manage to start gathering quite a big army. So Essex marches west as well, and places himself at Worcester to try and stop the king getting down to South Wales and also to the southwest, sort of Devon and Cornwall, where it's thought he'll collect even more men. So Essex is trying to stop the king getting any further west. But on his way to Worcester, as Essex approaches, there's the sort of first little mini battle which sort of sets the tone for the war. So there's a bunch of undergraduates at Oxford have decided that they're going to go off and fight for the king. And obviously the thing the king needs is some money. So they basically take all of the plate, i.e. all the precious metals from Oxford University, load them into wagons and head off to Shrewsbury. So meanwhile, the parliamentarians find out about this, and they sort of give chase and catch up with this lot in Worcester. So Essex's army is approaching Worcester from the east. He sends a force go down the river, River Severn, cross the river, and sort of sneak up from Worcester and behind, and are ready to sort of pounce as the wagon train full of plate leave Worcester. So early in the morning, the parliamentarian cavalry force ride into the outskirts of Worcester. What they hadn't realised is Prince Rupert had ridden south to rescue the plate, and so the parliamentarians ride right into Rupert's force. Both sides are quite surprised when they see each other at dawn, riding into one another. But Rupert leaps on his horse with all his men with him, and there's a very short, sharp action fought, which sees probably only 20 or 30 people unseated, wounded, a few killed, but the parliamentarian horse leg it and ride for miles in rout, and they ride right back to Essex's army, and Essex's lifeguard then get caught up in the rout, and they rout as well. So meanwhile, which allows Rupert and the wagon train of plate to make their getaway. So it's quite a small battle, and perhaps no great strategic importance, but it sets a precedent in how the armies start to think of one another, and it immediately gives this moral ascendancy to Rupert and the cavalier horse.
So there is a thing though here, isn't there, about Rupert's tactics with his cavalry? So I mean, some people talk about if you read a lot of like modern military history, you hear about the term like revolution in military affairs, and sometimes that kind of term gets applied to Rupert, because as I understand it, the cavalry of the era were essentially not the English Civil War, but the period immediately before it. Is there were cuirassiers and there were light cavalry, and cuirassiers are armored shock cavalry on heavier horses that are intending to deliver impact, and everybody else is going to run up in front of you, fire a brace of pistols, and then run off. We didn't have a lot of armor or heavy cavalry, but Rupert spent the summer training his horse to fight stirrup to stirrup as if they were cuirassiers. They're going to charge for impact. And so you've got these two totally... What the parliamentarian cavalry think is going to happen is there's going to be a skirmish exchange of shots, and then people retire, and Rupert's guys just plow into them.
Yeah.
And that gives us like that's we're not ready for that at all. There's a lot of shock factor.
That's right. So there's been this sort of evolution of cavalry, and that as you say, there has been this sort of idea that the cavalry are basically they all carry 2 pistols, and perhaps they carry a carbine, a longer firearm as well. And it's all about, basically bringing the enemy formation under fire, and then once they appear to be breaking up, then you go in with your sword. But on the continent, the Swedes, because they didn't have many cuirassiers, etc., and many heavy cavalry, got into the habit of they had to get stuck in. And so it was use your pistols, but wait until you're in contact with the enemy. So this is what Rupert was training his guys to do, was like, you have your pistol, but wait till you're in actually, you can press it against the enemy's buff coat and then fire. And so, as you say, that the parliamentarians who were being drilled to sort of fire and then turn their horse round, ride to the back and reload, the next rank come forward, they say, well, they're not playing the game. This isn't the way we're meant to be fighting, when the royalists charge straight in. So it's they're not playing. He's not playing the war the way he's meant to. And so it sets up Rupert as the royalist hero, and immediately, obviously, he's vilified by the parliamentarian pamphleteers in London. So it's strategically, it's of little importance at Battle of Powick Bridge, but it's the first sort of engagement of the war, and it sort of sets this moral ascendancy, which we'll see when it comes to the main battle. Perhaps one of the reasons why the sort of the action plays out as it does. So the king's continuing to recruit. He's getting quite a sizable army. The exact size of the army is always difficult to estimate, but Essex probably has slightly more men, but perhaps slightly less cavalry. So it's overall slightly more men, but slightly less cavalry. So the king's got to make a decision. Is he going to march down and meet Essex at Worcester, or does he march on London? So the idea is, if he can make it to London, perhaps he can knock the Parliament out, knock London out of the war, and then the Parliament cause will crumble. So he deliberates on this for a long time. So we were in sort of September when we were at Powick Bridge. So by October, he's made the decision he's going to march on London. So he sets off via good old Wolverhampton and Birmingham. He bypasses Warwick Castle, which is held for Parliament. Essex eventually discovers what the king is up to. He's heading down towards London. So Essex gives chase. Now, both armies are sort of learning how to scout at this point. And so they almost bump into one another just south of Warwick, sort of between Warwick and Banbury. So the king is sort of heading for Banbury. Banbury's held for Parliament, but it doesn't have a good city wall or anything like that, so it'd probably be quite easy to take. So he's looking like for it to be an easy victory. Essex doesn't have as far to go, but he catches up along a long ridge in Warwickshire called Edge Hill, which hence the battle, the name of the battle. So the two armies almost bump into one another. Allegedly Prince Rupert is on patrol and comes up to an inn and finds it full of parliamentarian troopers.
Right.
And suddenly they realise that the two armies are almost upon one another. So on October the 23rd, they wake up, and along the king deploys on the ridge. So he's actually got a better strategic position. So the king is now between Essex and London. So
he's out, without knowing it, he's outmaneuvered them. He's behind them, and they were both heading to London.
Yeah,
he started off behind them. So the king's on the high ground, which blocks the road, and it's important to remember that all of Essex guns and butter have got to come across that road that the King's army is now sat on.
Yeah.
It's worth reinstating, I think, at this point, because we said the war a few times. It isn't yet a war. There hasn't even been a battle, and I'm still firm. And there's a lot of people's letters survive. They still don't think that this is necessarily going to come to blows.
It's still a phony war up to this point. Yeah.
Yeah. This is the day that will change. Let me know when you need me to push the slides on, by the way, Andy.
Okay.
Or if I'm interrupting too much.
No. Just stop me if I can just witter on like this for hours.
That's what people are here for.
So the Edge Hill is actually quite a steep ridge, and Essex, especially as a cautious general, there's no way he's not going up there. So he deploys his army in quite a safe point, and the King's at the top of his hill. So perhaps if we go on to the next slide, please. I feel like Chris Whitty.
Can we all see that deployment at 2 p.m?
Yeah.
So excellent. So carefully color coded. So the good guys, the Royalists are in blue, and the Parliament guys are in red.
Blue Force is the good guys. Come on, you know this. You played computer games.
So in the morning, the King is actually slightly south off this picture, up on the top of Edge Hill, but there's no way Essex is going to attack. So by the early afternoon, the King and his generals decide they're going to march down march down to the foot of the ridge and see what happens from that point. So
he's also at a long-range disadvantage, isn't he? Because the cannon are not hugely significant in this period, but they're not irrelevant. And one of the things that cannon are used for is kind of, well, you better attack us because you're going to lose the cannon. You can't take this all day. But the King's artillery, he's only got something like 20 pieces, as the parliamentarians have maybe got half as much again. But also, they're better pieces because the Royal Armoury is in London. So when the King fled, he left the National Reserve of cannon there, which the parliamentarians are using. They're well supplied, lots of ammunition, the most modern and more powerful version. Whereas the King's got what he scrounged from people's estates and private armies. And even though he's on the higher ground, it's October. So as I understand it, the cannonballs that they're firing downhill, they just get stuck in the furrows because the fields below are ploughed. So they don't ricochet and have that effect of going through the ranks. It's one of those things that's really difficult to predict about a battlefield, is the cannon are not going to work right today. Napoleon had the same problem at Waterloo. The ground was too wet, so the cannon didn't bounce.
But cannonballs explode, don't they? I've seen it in them. Documentaries.
Yeah.
Big, huge plumes of smoke.
Absolutely. So the King decides he's going to have to make the first, and nobody, I think, wants to make that first move. They don't want to be the aggressor we don't want to be the one that started it. But the King then decides, all right, let's do this. Yeah.
So Rupert leaves his cavalry down, and it's actually quite a difficult maneuver to get down this hill because it is so steep. But Essex isn't going to try and interrupt them or anything. So they get down and deploy, and it's a relatively standard deployment for the period, where you deploy with your infantry in the centre and your cavalry on each wing. So it's probably worth pointing out that the infantry in this period are split between pikemen, who are carrying a 16-foot long ash pike with a very sharp steel point on the end, and musketeers, who are carrying a matchlock musket. Probably a lot of especially the Royalists with older equipment, have got a rest because the musket is so heavy, it's very difficult to use without a rest to fire it from. And they're firing it with a match to ignite it. The ideal at this time was to have 2 musketeers for every pikeman. That was the sort of what was becoming this is what we think is the ideal. In the Royalist army, they were really, really short of muskets at this point. So it was probably almost 1-to-1 muskets to pikemen, so they've got a firepower disadvantage. The cavalry, as we talked a bit about, so you've got, the ideal at this period was cuirassiers, so 3/4 armor, big horse, big blokes, 2 pistols, a big, sharp, long, stiff sword, a sort of broadsword, and to get stuck in, supported by lighter horse, who were providing more firepower with carbines. Now, the trouble with the cuirassiers and the horses to carry the cuirassiers, they're very expensive. So what was happening was there were being less cuirassiers, and so cuirassiers were sort of lightening, i.e. they were losing some of their armor, and the light horse were sort of starting to wear more armor, and so everything was coalescing towards just a standard of horse. So it's a bloke with a buff coat, a leather coat, a back and breastplate, a helmet if he was lucky, and hopefully 2 pistols. So there are probably some royalists who didn't have 2 pistols at this point while they weren't so well equipped. And the
royalists wear hats, right, rather than helmets.
Oh yes, yeah. So that's another. That's a sort of the classic Victorian thing, is that all the royalists wear a big floppy hat with a feather in. I suspect the cavalry on both sides, we know that there were lots and lots of instances throughout the wars, but especially at this battle, where people rode up to formations thinking it was their friends and then got captured or were injured
because they actually rode.
Yeah, because everybody looks exactly the same.
Helmet.
Yeah. So especially amongst the royalists, infantry, very few uniforms. People are just wearing their ordinary clothes. Cavalry may have some armor. Some of the parliamentarian regiments may be equipped with coats and maybe breeches, but one person's red coat, there's no national or even there's no uniforms for either side, so you're totally dependent on your flags to tell you who's who. So that's an important thing to think about. And then the final type of dragoons. So these are actually just infantry with muskets who have also got a horse for manoeuvring, but not to fight on. So they're just basically ponies, nags, so they can get places quickly, but they're going to fight on foot. And they're the best thing that armies have got in this time, of sort of troops to fight in poor terrain. So if you need someone to hold a village or scout a wood, then dragoons are the things to say. So you can see they're deployed right on the flanks of the army.
They function as like infantry, really, don't they?
Yeah, yes, very much so. Yeah. So they'll get there quickly on the horse, get off the horse, and and sort of a sort of early form of light infantry. Now you see, I've sort of tried to represent the infantry here in that, although he's the cavalry general, Rupert has tried to influence the way the royalist infantry are going to fight. So there's pikemen and musketeers, and a lot of the sort of military thinking at this time is, how do you organize pikemen and musketeers in blocks? You can just think of the war game, as a war gamer, you've got some pikemen and some musketeers. How do you organize those and deploy those to be most effective? So Rupert manages to persuade his uncle, the king, Charles, to use a quite complex Swedish formation that Gustavus Adolphus invented when he was having to primarily assault places with infantry and also fight against an enemy with superior cavalry. So he persuades his uncle to use this, and the actual general in charge of the army, who I completely forgot, Earl of Lindsey, who's actually Charles's general commanding the army, resigns over this because basically he's in charge of the army, and the king's allowed this 22-year-old who knows nothing to tell him how to deploy his men. So this caused a bit of upset. So the Earl of Lindsey basically resigns his position as general. He's raised a regiment, so he goes and takes position at the front of his regiment. And in case I forget to say later on, spoiler alert, he's killed in the battle. So So
now you have some pictures of these formations. Is it
yes, yeah. So let's go on and look at those. So this is the sort of standard formation, and so obviously there's a lot more men, and we're just using War Games figures here to sort of represent it.
Beautiful figures, Brandy. Beautiful figures. Seen these in the flesh, haven't we, James?
Yep.
So these are sort of pike and musket. So the classic formation is you have your stand of pike with the colours in the centre, and on either flank you have your muskets, your musket men,
your wings,
and your wings of musket. And as you sort of rank up more units, so this could be 3 regiments, say, in a brigade. You deploy them so that they can fall back in the gaps between the lines behind them, and it's a relatively straightforward formation. They go backwards and forwards with relative ease, and it's relatively easy for the troops, especially new troops and new officers, to understand how they fit into the brigade formations. So this is the standard, and it's a formation that Morris, who was a Dutchman in 1600, had sort of come up with, and so it's not new at this period, but it's the formations are getting simpler and thinner as they're developed in Germany in the 30 Years' War. So this is the sort of standard formation. If we go on to the next
this has got
picture,
that 2 muskets to 1 pikeman.
Yeah.
This is what your average Continental Army would deploy like.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. So some of the royalists would have probably had, half as many again pikemen and less. So they'd have had a bigger pike block and a smaller wings of muskets.
And then the Swedish formation then.
So this is the Swedish formation. So you can immediately see it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
So for veteran Swedes, they could really take advantage of this formation. So you can see they're leading off with pikemen. So anybody attacks the formation from the front is going to be met by pikemen. But the musketeers behind were trained to sort of to lap round the muskets, or lap round the pike, or move through the pike. It's got a reserve at the back. So it's an incredibly powerful and adaptable formation, but it's complicated to use, and the troops really have to be trained to use it. Now, interesting. So that
formation, yeah.
So Gustavus Adolphus comes up with this, and this is one of his great inventions. Although, so he was killed at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, and that's almost the last time his army used this formation.
Right.
So that's 10 years before this battle. So I think 1634 was the last time the Swedes used this formation. So I think it's interesting that even the Swedes by 1642 were not using this formation anymore, because we could, there's no clear reason why. It's they didn't document why they'd stopped using it, but it's thought it was just too complicated. The easiest way to train troops and to train formations to operate is just the classic brigade formation that we saw on the earlier screen. But
for anyone that doesn't know, because you mentioned the Swedes a few times, Gustavus Adolphus, for those that don't know, the Swedish army of the early 1600s through to 1650, arguably a little bit beyond, is the best army in the world. Everybody, this small nation today may be a small nation, but in 1610, it's a European superpower.
And so
it's a bit of a historical aberration for anyone that is not familiar with this period. They are a continental superpower.
And so I mean, that's a whole nother topic. But Gustavus Adolphus saves the Protestant cause in the 30 Years' War, and turns everything upside down. So his innovations are really popular, and Prince Rupert, who studied on the continent while he was actually in captivity for a long time. So it's very interesting that he managed to persuade the royalists to use this formation. But interestingly, they never use it again after this battle.
Right. So should we go back to the map?
Yes. Yeah. So, right. So the stage is set for the battle. So as you were saying, Kaiser, that the parliamentarians have got better and more artillery, and they start to open fire, which is probably right. That's the turning point now. They fired at the king. it's games on. So the Prince Rupert is commanding the royalist right flank of cavalry. There's a guy called Wilmot in charge of the left flank, and Sir Jacob Astley is commanding the royalist foot. So on Parliament side, the Earl of Essex is an overall command. The infantry commander probably wasn't even at the battle. So John Merrick, he was probably missing on the day. He was still marching from Worcester. There's a guy called Ramsay commanding the parliamentarian left wing, and we know a lot about him because of the court martial that happened after the battle.
Right. We got the documents.
Yes, yeah. And the parliamentarian commander on the other wing is a guy called I think Russell. So Essex is basically isn't going to come forward. He's not tempted forward, and you can see by having that sort of bad ground of enclosures, fields with hedges around, he's given himself some secure flanks, and he's just going to dare the royalists to come onto him. So Rupert is going to oblige. So as I said, he's got a lot to prove. He's never commanded in a big battle like this. He's 22. He's caused massive upset. He's got a lot to prove.
And he doesn't speak the lingua franca very well either.
He's no politician. He's no politician. He hates all the politics and court stuff.
But he's overall cavalry commander, but he is on the right wing. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. So
he doesn't really have any control over what goes on the left wing anyway.
No. And I think this is one of the interesting things when you read the accounts of any battle in this period is that from the point of when they basically marched forward, generals had very little control except who they could literally ride up and grab.
Yeah.
Very, very little control.
More sensible to do.
And so the classic in this period was that the guy in charge of the horse took the right wing and his second in command took the left wing. So that was so they set off towards the enemy line. So the Royalist Dragoons ride forward first, and they very successfully completely clear out the parliamentarian dragoons who were hiding amongst the hedgerows. So the first thing the parliamentarians are aware of is their dragoons are streaming back, and they've lost their sort of light cover from the flanks. And so, but they're like, well, okay, we know what we're doing. We're well equipped. We'll be okay. And it's also at this point where the King's Lifeguard of Horse, who you can imagine is full of all the most important and richest people in the Royalist force or in this force. Now they've been teased mercilessly for being the troop of show, in that they're always pulled out. They never get to do any fighting. They never get to go off and scout. They're always just parading around. And so their commander goes to the king and begs to be allowed to fight in the front of the army. And so the king allows this. Oh, yes, of course, you must be given this permission. So they take up their position on the extreme right of the army, which is the place of honor in the army. So the king's basically final defensive, his lifeguard, are now fighting in the front rank of that right wing as well.
His personal bodyguard.
His personal bodyguard, yeah. So they set off towards the parliamentarian left. It's also at this point that a troop of parliamentarian horse ride forward, take off their scarves or their sashes, and fire their pistols into the ground to signify they're changing sides. So some of the parliamentarians at this point change sides. So those guys on the left wing of the parliamentarian army have seen their dragoons go scurrying back. Some of their men have ridden over and joined the royalists. Interestingly, commanded by a guy called Sir Faithful Fortescue. And he turned out to not be terribly faithful. But they're going to follow their training. So they've got bearing down on them. They've got the finest cavalier horse, Prince Rupert, the evil Prince Rupert, the King's Lifeguard. So they've got some cannon there. They've got some musketeers to support the cavalry. They let off a volley. The smoke clears, and it's done nothing. And the next thing, bang, the royalist horse are in amongst them. And it's almost instantly over, and that entire Parliament left wing of cavalry turns and legs it. So it's exactly what Prince Rupert wanted, a massive, decisive victory for his wing straight away. But that's
so can
where
I say
things...
something about
Yeah.
Cavalier royalist horse at this point?
Mhm.
Because you're going to go on to explain how this all turns now, presumably. So one of the things about the royalist horse is the king didn't buy your horse, you did. The king didn't buy your armor, you did, etc., etc. These men are country gentlemen, at least.
Mhm.
These people are not so professional soldiers by any means, because this is a brand new army. It wasn't an existing army, although they've had some training. They're really not in the business of taking orders from anyone. They are kings of their own little patches of beautiful England, and this is going to cause a real problem in what I presume Andy is going to go on to explain over the next sort of phase. But it's important to understand perhaps that's not something that was easy to predict was going to turn out to be such a problem, and it will plague royalist horse throughout the period. Is that these country gentlemen just don't do what they're told.
Exactly, and fox hunting was probably their favourite pursuit.
Yeah.
At this point, and so I expect there was definite shouts of "view halloo," and they're off now. Certainly the leading formations needed to pursue. You had to pursue to make sure they were going, but the supporting regiments were meant to not pursue, and this is where the major failure happens. So Byron, who's commanding the support regiments on the right wing, they're so excited to see all their enemy fleeing that they join in the pursuit. So every royalist horseman on the right wing is now off to the northwest, pursuing and getting into the baggage and knocking people off their horses and looting and pillaging.
Yeah,
so it doesn't matter that they've won, because that's a no-score draw on the battlefield in terms of what's left, right?
Yes, yeah. So meanwhile, on the left wing, has played out in a pretty similar manner. The royalist dragoons there have pushed away their Parliament opposite numbers. The royalist horse on that flank has been similarly charged straight into the parliamentarian horse, who have similarly turned tail and streamed away. But in exactly the same way, the second line of royalists have joined in the pursuit in exactly the way they're not, as you said, that they should be. Their standing orders should have been to stand. And there's lots of recriminations after the battle, and the people in the second line claim they didn't understand their orders and they're new and things like this. But I think if we go on to the next slide, probably.
So if you've missed it, it's more obvious now, look, because the parliamentarians have got something left that the royalists don't.
So at this point, the royalist infantry are starting to come up. So Jacob Astley, as commander of the royalist foot, has a very famous bit where he has was become known as the soldier's prayer, because at the start of the battle he kneels down and says, "O Lord, thou knowest how busy I must be this day. If I forget thee, do not thou forget me." And he stands up and says, "March on, boys," which I think is probably one of the coolest quotes from the battle.
In that terrible movie, they have Cromwell say that, don't they? And
do they? Oh, dreadful.
He wasn't even at this battle.
He wasn't. No. He was late. He possibly turned up late, but it's not known if he was here really at all.
So, as much as this royalists, they've driven off the parliamentarian horse, a decent amount of their infantry has been lost as well. Yeah. It's not just that all the cavalry's gone, and I think, being a little bit fair, I think certainly once the parliamentarian right flank breaks, it does look like the battle has been won to those horsemen, because half of the enemy army is now in retreat and the royalist infantry is pushing on, but the parliamentarians have a reserve.
They do. So yeah, you're exactly right. So seeing a lot of their cavalry streaming away, some of the infantry without even firing a shot have thrown their pikes and muskets down and legged it as well. By the next day, some people had even ridden to London in their haste to escape and said the battle's over, the war's over, we've lost. So there are a lot of people run a long way away very quickly from that initial clash. So the royalist infantry come up, and you could say, well, the battle's over, isn't it? You know, as you say, half the parliamentarian army has disappeared. A lot of their infantry are running for the hills. It's now up to the infantry clash. So the infantry come up, and in this period, infantry are not always, well, very rarely, are they a decisive arm. So they fire relatively slowly. And once they get into combat, they'll fire a few volleys, keep advancing, fire some more volleys, and eventually they'll come to push of pike. So the pike lines will clash into one another, and it will be a pretty vicious, nasty hand-to-hand fighting. And then typically, if one side doesn't run away, both sides will pull back. The musketeers will keep firing rather. And the officers and NCOs will bash the pikemen back into formation, and then they'll go forward for another push. So this is starting
to rate of fire of the muskets and the distance, because the pike's a standoff weapon, and when you've both got a standoff weapon, it's quite possible to engage for a long period of time without much happening.
Yeah.
Because if one of you pushes, there's just a lot of skewering happens, and no one's going to do that.
Nobody wants to.
Is somebody going to break? Which is why horse ends up being so decisive, because it can give you that result.
Yeah. And at this point, that Essex in effect plays his trump card, and as you said, Kaiser, he has kept a reserve of horse, and this isn't just any old horse. These are mostly actually cuirassiers. So
lobsters
so this is the best of his force, led by two guys, Balfour and Stapleton, professional cavalry officers who fought on the continent, very well equipped. And because of in some ways fortuitously, because so much of their infantry has run away, there are gaps in the parliamentarian formation. And so the royalist infantry are fighting hard against their parliamentarian opposite numbers. And suddenly, they also actually now got the cuirassiers are starting to appear amongst their formations. And this is equally decisive, especially for sort of slightly green troops who are trying to struggle with strange formations that they haven't really practiced with. The royalist foot at this point in the centre start to give way. And there's a sudden break, and the parliamentarian cuirassiers in the centre, Balfour and Stapleton, actually break right through the royalist formation and basically make it right down to the bottom of the map as we see it. They almost make it as far as Radway. They get in amongst the royalist artillery. It's the classic. This is the Scots Greys from Waterloo all over again. They're in amongst the gunners. One of the officers dismounts and calls for nails to nail up the gun vents, but unfortunately nobody remembered to bring any nails, so that didn't work. So they just tried to cut the traces. Yes, they cut the traces, sabre the gunners. It's at this point that the king has 50 gentlemen pensioners, which sounds better, which sounds probably worse than it actually is. Gentlemen pensioners at this point were sort of the great and the good, not Chelsea pensioners.
They retain the pension they retain. They're paid by the crown.
They're paid by the crown. That's right. They're the last people the king has, and he has his son Charles and James, who are I think 13 and 11, at the battle with him. And at this point, he thinks, "Oh, this is getting a bit serious now." So he actually sends the gentlemen pensioners with the princes back. And some of the parliamentarian crowds actually get as far as chasing after them, but I think they sort of lose heart after a couple of them are nastily cut down when they get too close to the pensioners, who were quite well equipped and handy with a cavalry poleaxe. So so the princes managed to escape. The king decides to go forward to try and rally his infantry. The parliamentarian Kraziers rally and return back to the centre, where things are starting to go quite badly for the royalist infantry, who are becoming pushed back at this point. So there's a quite a dramatic point where the Parliament infantry on the left flank, the royalist infantry on the royalist left, have got the King's Life Guard of Foot, so his foot regiment, and in amongst them they've got the Knight Marshal Verney, who's carrying the royal banner. So this is different to the royal standard. This is the banner royal. So this is the coats of arms quartered. So he's carrying that amongst his life guard, and the Kraziers get into the back of the formation, and there's it's one of these things that is it true or not, but allegedly they had to, even after they'd killed Verney, they had to cut his arm off at the wrist to get the standard away from him, because he was not letting go even in death. So they capture the banner royal,
and he allegedly cuts down 5 guys defending the standard.
Yes.
Allegedly.
Yeah. So the battle is full of little dramatic flourishes of individual actions that come out, and each of these things would be great to sort of skirmish game some of the little small actions, like the escape of the princes and the sabering of the gunners, etc.
Yeah.
So things are starting to go quite badly for the royalist infantry. So their formations are being broken. Some of them are starting to flee, and they're pushed back. So I think if we go on to the next slide. So it's starting to get dark. It's October, so the evening comes on quite quickly. It's starting to get dark, and you can see the royalists are pushed right back to their almost back to their start positions. But some of the royalist horse are starting to come back onto the field. So Charles Lucas manages to rally about 200 of the royalists who've been pursuing and looting the baggage, and brings them back onto the field, and they start to come back to support the infantry. But at this point, my favourite little account is a Captain John Smith in the Royalist Horse, who to me is sort of the Chuck Norris of the Cavalier Army, has his little moments on the battlefield. So he's had a pleasant afternoon chasing parliamentarians around the countryside. He's captured a few standards. He's had a good afternoon. So him and a couple of friends are riding back onto the battlefield, and they're sort of making their way cautiously back to the royalist lines. And one of his followers says, those men over there have got the banner royal. They're making off with the banner royal. He says, no, they can't have. But this chap managed to persuade him that they are walking off with the banner royal. So there's a man on foot who's carrying the banner royal, which had been allegedly cut from Sir Verney's hand and taken back to Essex, who'd said, well, we'll send that back to the camp. We'll probably give it back to the king tomorrow, but we'll keep it for this evening. So he was sending it back to the rear. So it was being carried by a man on foot who had an escort of six or so chaps of his Kraziers were escorting this man back. So Smith says, well, I'm not allowing that. They're not taking the banner royal. So he throws down the standards he's already captured, and rides up into this formation of people who are like, well, who the hell is this? And basically snatches the banner royal. The Kraziers, one of them allegedly attacks him with what's called a poleaxe, one of the nasty cavalry weapons at this period. The swords aren't that good against guys in armor, but a nice sort of metal hammer with a pick edge as well would be very good against a man in armor. So he gets a blow from that on his collar, but he shrugs that off. Stabs the Krazier, who falls from his horse, and allegedly the rest of the Kraziers then fled the scene and leave him with the banner royal. So he's recaptured the banner royal. So hurrah! But that's not good enough for him. So he gives the banner royal to his mate. He's
still got this other guy's hand attached, according to
probably. He's still got Verney's hand attached, probably. So he sends his pal back to the royalist lines, and then basically sets off and then basically sets about every parliamentarian he can find until it's too dark for him to find any more people. And just to sort of switch forward, the next day, obviously the king's very grateful for having his banner royal recovered, and he knights John Smith on the field of battle. So he becomes a knight banneret, and it's supposedly the last time a king knights somebody on the field of battle and makes them a knight banneret. But even that's not enough for John Smith, who then immediately apparently mounts up after this, collects 30 or so of his friends, and goes off and basically parades in front of the Parliament army the next day, daring them to attack him. And when they refuse to, he then rides off with their cannon, which had been left on the field of battle. So he captures their cannon as well. So what a chap! What a chap! So there's.
And then they named the beer after him, right?
Yeah.
And they named a beer after him.
As Miller
Captain John Smith. Yeah.
So the battle, it gets dark. Everybody's exhausted. This is one of those battles that's been looked at over and over in the kind of, if this had been different. And that was kind of one of the reasons I wanted to talk a little bit about that country gentleman problem with the royalist force. I mean, I don't. If you play a war game, some of those units will rally. Some of those units won't run off the table. But the reality is, I don't think there was anyone or anything that was going to stop them, because they did that without orders of their own free will, right?
Yeah.
Those second lands. But it isn't just the pursuit that's the problem. It's when they start returning to the field, they're exhausted. This map is quite big for a battlefield.
Yeah.
That we're seeing here, and they've gone off. In some cases, they've gone. Isn't the baggage over at Kinnerton?
Yes,
the town that's off the map. They've charged or galloped these horses quite a significant distance in the preceding sort of hour. So the state that the royalist horse returned to the battlefield in, they're not ready to mount another charge, and so But then the parliamentarians have got this royalist horse behind them. So everybody starts to sort of back off, and it's getting dark. Is that right?
That's right. So that's exactly it. So when I calm down from getting excited about John Smith and come back to the battle, as you say, that so the royalist horses come back, but they're not in any fit state to make much difference. The parliamentarian horse that have left are also exhausted. You know, they've been chopping through royalist infantry all afternoon, and are exhausted. Both infantry sides, they've been at it for hours now, and it's getting dark, and both sides sort of mutually pull back, exhausted at this point. And then the argument is then, well, but who won? So
no one.
Of course, both sides
Sounds
claimed
like no one. Yeah.
Both sides claimed victory, and I'd say that it ended up being, I think, tactically as a battle, it's sort of a no-score draw. But I think the significant thing is that the king is still between Essex and London, and the king is now in a position where he can march on London still.
But it is October.
But it is October. Yeah.
And that's a big problem. And the king's got problems with his own supplies. He doesn't have an arsenal yet, does he? Does he catch Bristol later?
Yes, yeah, Bristol's next year, 1643. Yeah, they captured Bristol.
So the king literally has no man. Well, in Newcastle, but that is a long way.
A long way away.
Yeah. And although this is a relatively short distance to London, because this is one of those moments when that if the king was ever going to win the English Civil War, he was going to win it today, or he was going to win it in the next few weeks if he marched on London successfully. Almost certainly, if all of that royalist horse hadn't ridden off the field, they had won the battle at 3:00 and lost it at 4. Right? It's definitely one of those.
Yeah, I mean it's the what ifs, isn't it? What if the royalist second line of horse hadn't charged off the field, and so they'd still been a reserve? What if the Life Guard hadn't been so embarrassed by the fact they hadn't seen any action and had stayed on the field and had been there to stop Balfour and Stapleton breaking through?
Yeah.
So yeah. So
what if the king had marched on London? But
yeah.
I don't think the king was going to make it to London. I don't mean because of the troops, but because of the weather, because of the state of the roads in winter. This is the end of the campaign season.
Yeah.
And I mean, the royal baggage train is something like 50 wagons. The guy carries like tapestries and stuff around to put up wherever he stays. He's carrying his furniture with him.
Yeah. See, he's got no capital at this point.
We know that for sure because they capture it later in the war. He's literally got a palace in the wagons going with him because he's the king, right?
So
he's the king.
Essex, who's pessimistic, of course, carries his coffin in his baggage train just in case.
Interesting.
But this is a really good one for war gamers as well because it's full of what ifs. But I like a lot of English Civil War battles, which I hadn't realized until I did some rereading for this episode, so that Andy didn't embarrass me too much with his superior knowledge. It's just how balanced so many of these battles are. Certainly in the first couple of years, how comparable the forces are in size and scale.
Yeah. So I mean, it's as you say that it's some of the latest views are it was about 12 or 13,000 aside. 12 or 13,000 aside.
Yeah. Most people seem pretty fixed on the about 10,000 foot aside.
Yes.
And maybe 30,000 in total on the battlefield. I see that number all over the place.
Yeah.
But precisely how many men are with the cannon and with the particular horse groups, etc. So what's it like for those of you that stood there? I mean, in Seal, do you stand there for 6 hours holding a pike?
Yep.
There's a lot of standing around. There's a lot of waiting. It's the waiting that gets to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's the waiting that gets to you.
And how heavy is that gear? How tired are you by 4 o'clock?
It's pretty hefty. Yeah.
A pike actually is a pretty unwieldy and heavy thing, and I think most of us carried. They weren't proper ash pikes that's heavy. They weren't, and we didn't carry them with metal. They didn't have steel tips on the end, but they're still a very unwieldy, tiring thing to
even
carry
just
around.
laying against your shoulder all day.
Yeah. When you have it at charge, so your sort of right arm is balancing it. That's very, very tiring. Period. Right. And if you're actually having to stab somebody and somebody's trying to stab you, that's incredible. It's very hard on the arm.
Is why they will separate and then close and separate and then
close again. Yeah.
It's not feasible to continue fighting, presumably.
Yeah. No, it's a really big, strong effort to
rather
carry out that
with a tapestry than a coffin.
Exactly.
Well, then you deserve to be king, Alid. And so, just a few questions, if I may. So, we saw some of your miniatures. There's beautiful miniatures. We can go back to this. One thing I've never been clear on is there any significance to the nature of the flags? Most English Civil War miniatures I've seen, there's 2 flags, and usually one of them is a flat collar with a cross of St. George or something. Is there particular patterns within the flags? Yeah,
so there was there were some standard patterns that were suggested to be followed. So each regiment was made up of 10 companies, and each company had a colour. So if you had a full strength regiment, it would have 10 colours. So often, though, regiments weren't at full strength. They might not have all their companies, or if they were, they might actually on the battlefield be split into several formations. So they were very happy at this period to split regiments up or to amalgamate regiments to make formations. It was all about that they would decide that they wanted blocks to be a particular size, say 500. We want our blocks to be 500 pike and musket, and so they'll then divvy the regiments up to make 500s, and they're not too worried about splitting people up.
So there would often be several colours from those regiments.
The colonel's colour was typically a single plain colour. So if your flags were red, you'd have just a big red flag. Then the major's colour would have just a St. George's cross in the canton in the top left corner. And then the 8 captains would then have some device to signify the captains. They might have a dot, so they might have a white dot on the field, or perhaps a wavy line coming out of the canton. So there were different patterns that they would use to then signify the different companies.
And each one would be a different colour?
They would be all the same colour, so they'd all be red. So if you were a red, yeah.
Right, but one of them would have the cross in the corner.
So the colonel's colour would just be red. Mm-hmm. The majors would have a canton and be red. Then the captains would be red with a canton and some other device to signify which captain it was, 1 to 8.
But all of those flags would be in the pike block in most cases.
Yeah.
So there'd be a lot of flags. It sounds like.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So and you see some people, like, who have proper big size pipe blocks. You can put a lot of flags in there, and you're not far wrong, actually, because it looks brilliant. It's one of my favourite things about the way the game looks is having all those flags in there.
Right. Question from Thomas. Thomas Chase. I assume you've gamed this battle. I'm going to guess you probably even demoed it. But how was the experience based upon historical rule results? What rule sets have you played?
I've fought things that were very close to being Edge Hill. I've never I haven't done a sort of demo level game of Edge Hill. I think as you point out, Kais, I think one of the things that rules don't do is they do allow you to rally your troops far more easily than they actually could, especially cavalry. Cavalry are pretty much a one-shot weapon. Once a cavalry formation is charged, the horses are blown. That cavalry isn't really going to do much more in the battle. And I think also we have far too much command and control over our troops. As I said, by halfway through a war game, you're still saying, well, I think I'd like that unit over there to sort of pull back to the centre, or I want that unit just to turn on the flank over there as the general. But really, as a general, you'd have, unless you rode over there and grabbed the officer in charge of that unit and said, right, do this, all control was lost, and the army was going to basically fight itself based on its standing orders and stuff.
And your great commanders, your Napoleons and your Hannibals, were people who had a good idea of how the battle was going to play out and could prepare those maneuvers in advance.
Yeah,
they're not doing it. They're not doing it in real time. This was all planned.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways Edge Hill is a good battle to Wargaming. As you said, it's fairly even. I think I would, from Wargame's point of view, I think when you go on to some of the later battles, like Naseby is, I think it's almost, which is 1645, it's the last major battle maybe. It's where the king loses the hot war of the English Civil War.
Yeah.
Is a really difficult battle for the Royalists to stand a chance of winning. They're so outnumbered at Naseby. So I fought Naseby several times, funnily enough, and it's not much fun as a Royalist because you're so outnumbered. It's very, very difficult to even do as well as they did on the day. But this battle is good in that it's very evenly set up. Both sides don't really know what they're doing. You've got some chance to have some Krasiers on the field because they basically became less popular. But as the war went on, they were expensive to field. Nobody wanted to campaign as a Krasier. It's probably good as a war game in that you get to, however rubbish you are, you won't be any worse than they were in the actual battle. Because none of them knew what they were doing either.
Yes. Yeah. And in terms of skirmish, so this was one of the things that I was wondering. One of the things you mentioned earlier about the English Civil War and the documentation, and there are things that we know a lot about, and there are other things that there are gaps in. But it's the surviving documentation. We got a lot of letters, but we didn't talk about much about at the beginning was that geopolitical situation. It's not like Parliament owns the bottom half of the country and the king owns the top half. Within every county, there are rival strongholds, and by strongholds I mean Mrs. So-and-so and her 20 servants and their guns. This the English Civil War, a bit like the American Civil War in its early phases, there are hundreds of instances of manor houses being attacked by 50 guys and so forth, all over the country all the time. One of the things in the first few years of the war is that both sides consolidate the regions that they control. the King's very good at that at the beginning, less good later. So there seems to me to be a lot of scope for skirmish gaming.
Yeah, hugely. And as you said, to hold an area, you have to garrison it. So there are lots of small garrisons of, even just 10 or 20 guys, as you say, holding an area. And they've got to feed themselves. So if the local population aren't friendly, they've got to go out and basically take what they need, which doesn't make them any more popular. But and then similarly, as people were marching about, if you march past a fortified manor house, controlled by the enemy, you had to watch out. They might decide to come out and take some of your baggage because they needed it, sort of thing. So there's lots of incidents like that.
But do you know many systems like that? Because I haven't come across it. But then it's not a big period. Skirmish wargaming in this era. Do you know of any interesting rule sets? Because I'm quite interested in having a go at that.
So Pikeman's Lament is good for that sort of game. I don't know. So it's based on Lion Rampant, which is a medieval set. It's one of the Osprey thin blue sets.
We know it. So don't worry.
they've got there's a set called Pikeman's Lament, which is,
and that's the skirmish rule.
And that's the skirmish level game where you have sort of might be 40 aside sort of thing.
Right. It's not that those 40 models represent, it's not they just represent the regiment. There's different ways of depicting that. Right. Pikeman's Lament might have a look at that. Because I think there's some good scope for storytelling and really kind of getting into the character of it. Yeah. That's the other thing, of course, to how brutal this war will become. Because the foreigners are foreign, but that guy's a traitor.
Yeah.
That's proper scum. That is. Yeah. Doesn't get worse than that. Even if it turns out in many cases it's my dad over there.
As the war goes on, it's depressing how, and it's exactly the same you'll see in every country which goes into a civil war, how it becomes nastier and nastier and nastier as there are reports of sackings of cities, and so then the next city that gets sacked by the other side is seen as a reprisal and the leveling up, and so it becomes more and more unpleasant as the war goes on, as civil wars I think everywhere always do. So at Edge Hill, everybody started off in a very gentlemanly manner. There was.
They agree at start time, don't they?
Yes.
We'll start when we're going to start the battle. Yeah. Literally discussed before.
Yeah, and the next day there were lots of exchanges of messages, and as I say, that families that were fighting against one another would then agree to go out and look for each other's missing family members and things like that. So it was still more gentlemanly in inverted commas, even after the battle. But the battle also shocked many people on both sides, and both royalists and parliamentarians have peace parties very much after this battle, by people who've just been horrified when they've seen the battlefield the next day littered with the dead and the wounded. So the real horror of war comes home. So it makes some people, some of those involved are now more grimly determined to pursue the war because of what's happened, and some are like, no, this is it. We've got to find a solution. We can't have another battle like this.
Yeah, and it will get much worse than this, as you say.
Yeah,
and it reaches the pinnacle in Ireland immediately after the war. It's just getting bloodier and bloodier.
Yeah.
Right. Has anyone got any more questions for Andy before we wrap up? I just have a quick check in the chat. I mean, so I think it's an odd thing to say, but I found the same thing with some of our other kind of battle reports. The chat goes real quiet. We get very little commentary, but that's because people are listening. I think that's what's happening there. They don't want to interrupt the flow with the questions. I've found it really, really insightful and interesting. It's a period like so many others, but it's a period that I'm really interested in. I found myself looking at miniature ranges this week. Having looked at this thinking, what to do if I'm doing it big? Would I want to do it in 15 mil? I wonder if somebody like Pendraken does them. that kind of thing. Yeah, so we're getting their comments. Another great show. Yeah, great listening. For anyone that's here that's was missed the Saturday show, my apologies. We're going to try and reschedule. Harry was caught up in the whole bushfire situation in Australia. It wasn't until he made that public. I wasn't. It's not my business to say. He's fine. His wife's car is covered in fire retardant paint though, which doesn't seem to want to come off. But yeah, that's why that was cancelled at short notice. But we are going to get Harry and do some Fog of War reviews covering the big new mid-war release, which is coming out, The Desert, which should be exciting. Please let us know in the comments how you felt about these. Andy's putting, if you've seen his notes, they're massive. The guy's put a lot of time in this, and I certainly appreciate it immensely. I've enjoyed myself tonight. Thank you, Andy. But if you want to see more of this kind of content, if you'd like to see Andy, but he may never speak to us again after today, who knows? But do let us know, and make sure I'll forward that on. Other than that, where did you get up to with your hobbying tonight, John?
I just got to do the bases on the Romans, and then that's all right. But got a Scorpion and stuff. Woo!
Look at that! Nearly ready for some more.
I was following along. Look, I got my own maps.
You got a map!
Oh, brilliant! Yes,
I was checking it out. I was checking your maps versus these maps.
Did Rose
I was trying not to break copyright.
Seems pretty legit.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really enjoy Living History Book Live. It's great. Yeah, absolutely. James, did you get anywhere?
Yeah, I got pretty far. I've done his little suede coat. That's pretty good. I'm enjoying it.
Got some
I'm
paint
painting
on
for a
there.
while.
Right.
So,
Alan's a great show. Miller's Miniatures. Cheers, been good. If we did get Andy back, leave in the comments what battle you'd like to see. I want to see the Cornish storming a hillside town. I forget what it's called. What's that battle called?
Stratton.
That looks like a good one to.
Just outside Bude. Very nice holiday destination. I don't know if James ever went.
Been there to reenact, haven't you?
I did not know.
Yeah. It was every year they had the Battle of Stratton. It was fabulous. Trip to the seaside.
All right, guys. Hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.
Bye.